All right, this is so exciting. Hi, welcome to our very first ever episode of Mosaix Today with Rachel and Mark. I'm Rachel Gilmore, and I'm here with Mark DeYmaz. How are you doing today, Mark?
So I'm so good to be at this moment. You and I have talked about this for quite a while. We are finally here and excited to get going.
I know it's amazing. So, for those of you tuning in, hopefully for the first time in every single episode that follows, we'd like to begin just by telling you a little bit about ourselves, our story, how we met, how this podcast came about. So, Mark, you want to dive in first and tell us a little bit about yourself and Mosaics?
Yeah, sure. Rachel, as you know, I was born out of wedlock 1961 to a single parent, raised in Alameda, San Francisco Bay Area, selling Avon on the streets at 7 years old and gigging it all my life. Hardworking, blue collar. I love it. Love hard work, been at it. Was raised Jesuit Catholic, came to know the Lord as a 19-year-old college sophomore playing college baseball. And a few years that baseball career. I was too slow to get drafted. They said I ran like I had a piano on my back. So that was the end of that career. And I had nothing better to do. I was a psych major. I was just 3 years into my salvation when the church that I'd become a Christian at invited me to come be a youth pastor. That led to an 18-year student ministries career. The final 8 of those landed me here in Little Rock, Arkansas, working for a mega church that when I came in 1993 was 2,000 people. By 2001, it was 5,000 people. The youth group had grown from 150 to 600. I was in the top 2% of youth pastors paid in America. I built a $3.5 million student center by my design. We paid cash for it. I was living the dream, living the life. And then one day in the late 1990s, I looked around at this otherwise amazing church and realized that the only people of color were janitors. And that began to bother me. I wasn't sure in the moment why that bothered me, but that led me on an exegetical exploration of the New Testament where I came to discover that every church in the New Testament outside of Jerusalem was what we would call today a healthy, multi-ethnic, and economically diverse church. Men and women, Jews and Gentiles, rich and poor, willing themselves to walk, work, and worship God together as one in order to advance a credible gospel of God's love for all people, not just some on earth as it is in heaven. And so in 2001, I left that church, planted the Mosaix Church of Central Arkansas right here in Little Rock, came to the urban center, 30% poverty, 66% of kids without dads in the home, highest violent crime in the city. I can't even believe it, Rachel, but I'm coming up on 20 years that I've been at this work. In 2004, together with Dr. George Yancey, we started the Mosaix Global Network to assist other pastors, ministry leaders, churches, nonprofits, and schools trying to become healthy, multi-ethnic, economically diverse organizations, again, to engage their communities in a credible way in the 21st century. And today, of course, that's led to conferencing, a variety of products and services and help that we offer to the American church and even beyond across the board. And of course, that's what led me to you a number of months ago, the great work that you were doing with Path One and the United Methodist Church. You were so kind to have me on one of your podcasts, and the rest is history, as they say.
It was great. It was exciting to make that connection because so often you see these churches that are growing, they're thriving, they're reaching new people in really innovative ways that all of us need to learn from, like the multi-ethnic, all the entrepreneurial resources you offer. But most church plants don't always share those resources or feel like their role is to guide and mentor and help others come to the place where they're at. So, what about your story or your drive or your calling led you to say, listen, I'm not going to pour all my interests and time and energy solely into the church, although that matters. I'm here, I'm present, I'm a leader, but I also want to empower and encourage other churches to follow this paradigm. What
Yeah,
made you do
that's a
that?
great question. Yeah, that's a great question. And really, it was in the beginning, in those first few years, 2001, 2, 3, 4, not only myself, but there was very few people in the United States actually and intentionally moving in the direction that I was or that we were here in Little Rock. That is building healthy, multi-ethnic, and economically diverse churches. Most people were following a misguided understanding of the homogeneous unit principle out to plant, grow, and develop churches focused on a single people group. When people would hear my vision, my story, they would basically say, that can't happen. It's not meant to be. That's not biblical. And it was very discouraging. And rather than people being excited, I'm talking about other ministry leaders and pastors, they were rather discouraging. And so in those early years, every now and then I would run into someone and I'd share my story and share what God had put on my heart. And they'd say, "Hey, I think there's a guy in Cincinnati doing that." And so just for like looking for rain on a parched desert landscape, I tracked my way down to that guy, Chris Beard in Cincinnati, Ohio, and together we'd get on the phone and we'd commiserate, and we were like, "You're finding the same thing? Oh man! And what are you learning?" And so there was mutual encouragement, there was peer learning, and that essentially is what led Dr. George Yancey and I to recognize that the very few and far between folks that were out there thinking like we were, as well as implementing or with intentionality pursuing this dream, they needed to come together. Of course, there wasn't a Facebook back then, there wasn't Facebook groups, any of those other ways. And so basically, it was all done by the phone and getting people together on retreats and eventually into national conferencing and many other ways. But at the end of the day, Mosaix started as a resource to connect people of like mind who are pursuing that similar dream, again, so that they could find mutual encouragement, peer learning and resourcing. And of course, all of that led to the movement that exists today.
I love that. And I think it's so crucial because people in this kind of ministry can feel so isolated or siloed or not know who else is out there, what they're doing, how to connect. And I've heard that over and over from folks like in the Mosaix Fellow program. They talk about how these conferences have been like a light bulb going off for them. Like, wow, there are other people doing this, alongside me. I don't have to do this in a vacuum any longer. And those relationships really matter. I think that's what one of the first experiences I had, especially as a female planter. So I'll dive in and share a little bit about my story.
Yeah, I was going to say, okay, I was going to say enough about me. Let's hear your story.
But it's so fascinating. I love it. So I was born in Santa Ana, California. There are four kids in my family. My parents had four kids in 5 years, so I'm a twin. And my dad was a Navy chaplain, Methodist, and my mom is ordained in the American Baptist Church. So I kind of grew up in a mixed marriage there with the theological influences, which I loved. So I've moved about, well, I think 17 times in my life from coast to coast. So from California up to Bremerton, Washington, down to Pensacola. I spent a lot of time in Virginia Beach, Connecticut, graduated high school from Okinawa, Japan. And so for me, because I moved so much, the only constant for me, what felt like home to me, was the church, the Navy chapel, wherever we were at. And I love the diversity there because in the Navy, sometimes the chaplain leading our Sunday morning worship was Lutheran, sometimes Seventh-day Adventist, sometimes it was, my dad and Methodist tradition. But the beauty of the people that came together, you had enlisted and officers worshiping together, to me really shaped and formed my own theological heritage. And I should have realized that I might have been called into ministry because gosh, the first Methodist pastor was ordained in my family in 1912. So there has been
Wow.
a Methodist pastor consecutively preaching every single year since 1912. And my older sister got a degree in Christian education. My twin sister got a degree in peace psychology, doing work in Rwanda. But I was called into ministry and I fought against it because I realized how hard it can be. But I met this amazing man in college, Brandon, who was also called into ministry. And he said, "Are you okay being married to a pastor?" And I said, "Well, only if you're okay being married to a pastor." So we got engaged, got married, and within our first year of marriage, we were off to Bulgaria to serve in the Peace Corps for 2 years, which again was a powerful experience, just seeing how God is worshipped in all these different contexts, and to also see some of the impact of like this colonial approach to church planting that limits the beauty of multi-ethnic worship by saying, this is the exact liturgy you always have to follow. These are the songs you will sing. Like it blew my mind the first time I worshiped at a Methodist church in Sofia, Bulgaria, that they were singing all the songs from America, but in their language, and the doxology in their language. And while that's beautiful, that connection, kind of that McDonaldization of faith, I struggled and I was like, well, what about your history? What about your culture? What about how do you cry out to God in the language and the song of your people? So it was a great experience. Then we came back. We went to Duke together, and I found out I was pregnant with my son during our last year at Duke's, and then was appointed by my bishop in Virginia. We're both elders in the Virginia Annual Conference to plant a church right out of seminary. And I was like, "I'm sorry, what is church planting? I have no idea what this is. I've never been assessed. God, like, what are you up to? I'm a young mom. I have a 6-month-old. My husband's in ministry at another church. Like, none of this makes sense." And God made it really, really evident that this was a calling that He'd placed on my life, and it was up to me whether or not I'd be faithful to it. Right. So I learned and I grew. It ended up being the toughest and most beautiful ministry I'd ever been a part of. So I planted the Gathering in Virginia Beach back. Well, I started in 2009. We launched weekly worship in 2010, and when I left in 2019, we had about 250 people on Sunday mornings, another 250 online. But what I loved about it was kind of what you were talking about. We had, in worship, we had people who were homeless that were worshiping alongside people who were millionaires. We had a Wednesday program that partnered with a food bank to provide fresh produce, meat, bread, dairy items for the entire community. And since the outbreak of COVID, they've served about 40,000 people. And the folks that show up to prepare all the food, it's like completely diverse. It's like one third Latinx, one third African American, one third Anglo, and they're worshiping together. They're sharing prayer requests. They're becoming members and baptized in this Wednesday feeding ministry. So to me, it was just a beautiful example of what the church could be. We had a homeless camp right outside of our property. And every year for Christmas, we would house the homeless, because what better way to celebrate Christmas morning, right, than to be with your brothers and sisters experiencing homelessness. So it was an incredible experience. Absolutely loved it. Loved the people, loved the faith community. But then God called me to Path One. For the last 18 months, I served there as the director of recruiting, assessment, and training for clergy and lay church planters in the UMC. And again, it was a reminder. I was just excited to hear what people are doing everywhere and to hear more of your story and to connect and say, wow, like this is amazing. Because we'll talk a little bit later, but the whole entrepreneurial approach to planting to help make it financially sustainable, which I think is a huge hurdle for church plants today, was something that I learned about early on and had a few external revenue streams, right, to help fund my church plant in Virginia Beach. But it's been an amazing experience. I'll be heading off to plant again starting in July in a very multi-ethnic context. So I'm excited to apply what we're talking about on these podcasts, every day of the week as I continue to serve in a local congregation in the UMC. So, but
When I
yeah.
hear your story, Rachel, hey, when I hear your story, I mean, of your upbringing and travels and having to go from Japan to Bremerton, Washington, down to Pensacola, the life experience you have, the history of your family, even today, and the work that you did in planning that church. It seems like you and others like you, it's for such a time as this. God is doing something in the church, not only here in the United States, but around the world. I believe that moving the church away from homogeneity to building, again, healthy, multi-ethnic, economically diverse, culturally intelligent, socially just churches and financially sustainable to sustain that work, that is the critical work of the Holy Spirit in the 21st century. I truly believe that, because apart from us having the cultural intelligence you describe as having gained throughout your life experience and even the work that you've done, that cultural intelligence is necessary to advance a credible gospel in an increasingly diverse society.
Absolutely. And I'm so grateful. I'm a millennial technically. I'm an older one, but I'm grateful for the internet and for, I even got on the app Clubhouse. I think you are too, a few weeks ago, and the way that it's opened up doors to communicate. I mean, last week I was talking to three people from Germany about fresh expressions and what they're seeing over there in Europe and comparing it to what we're seeing here in the US. So you're right. In terms of being multi ethnic, it's important to do it localized right where we're at, but then also realize there are stories, there are people just hungry and longing to understand if God's love is relevant for them and includes them in their story and their life and their place as well. So the sky's the limit in terms of who we can reach, how we continue to start faith communities that truly have a positive impact for the kingdom of God.
Yeah, so let's talk a little bit, if we could, about Mosaix Today. This is our new podcast representing the Mosaix Global Network, as we've said. And of course, people listening to this, you can read about it. We're all about planting, growing, and developing healthy, multi-ethnic, economically diverse churches that are culturally intelligent, socially just, and financially sustainable. And that's what Rachel and I are going to be talking about from episode to episode here on Mosaix Today. We called it Mosaix Today because we want it to be fresh. I mean, we're talking about what's happening right now. And of course, in the early episodes, we'll lay a foundation theologically, best practices, a movement that is now about 20 years old. So just like a 20-year-old, it's still got a ways to go in terms of maturity, but it's come a long way as well. And we'll lay some of that in the first episodes. But Rachel, what was your interest in working with me to pull off and to put on this podcast.
Yeah, well, I was just super excited. I feel like now more than ever, churches that never considered the importance of a multi-ethnic ministry or identity are realizing the need for that. You know, in the light of the murder of George Floyd and all of the Black Lives Matter, that movement and all the protests, the church is realizing. Well, I can just speak from my context. In the United Methodist Church in the United States, we are 94% white, and that's a problem, right? And for the first time, maybe because of the pandemic and we're stuck inside more, we're realizing, wow, we have a lot of work to do for such a time as this, as you mentioned. And so I'm seeing growing interest, even in super established, you know, aging congregations, to kind of make reparations, to heal, to learn, to lean in. And, you know, I also love, and I'm excited about this podcast because we're going to offer these resources and tools for folks that are desperate to start a new faith community, but don't know how financially to make it happen, right? Because in seminary, they never had a budgeting class that I had to take. How are we going to pay the bills? What is this going to cost? So I just feel like I'm excited about and feel like this podcast is going to be so helpful because it's both biblically grounded, you know, theologically grounded, but also super practical. Like, what are we seeing? How have you done it? How have I done it, you know, a few decades later? And what tips do we offer to others who are in the trenches right now, just wanting that lifeline to know they're not alone?
Yeah, and I love in terms, folks. I hope you're hearing this, but Rachel is. I'm not going to give her age away, but I don't mind telling you, I'm 59 years old. She's much younger than I am, which is wonderful. Of course, a male and a female are experiences of life, as well as the fact that Rachel comes from a mainline denomination, working with the UMC. Path One, in case you didn't know, is the new church starts for the United Methodist Church, helping, and Rachel's done that through podcasting and a variety of resourcing, particularly the United Methodist churches over the last few years, helping them to start new churches. As she mentioned, mainline churches, and a broader than just the UMC, today only 11% of mainline churches have at least 20% diversity in their attending membership. That's down from 12% in 2012. Evangelical churches, by the way, are at 23% now. But again, just having diversity in your congregation doesn't necessarily make you a healthy multi-ethnic church. That just gets you in the door, so to speak. And again, on this podcast, we're going to be talking about these things from a theological and practical level. We'll be examining common and core commitments and common challenges, bringing to the table some authors and resources of people that are actually informing practice, actually doing things, and all with an eye to helping you get beyond rhetoric to results for the glory of God. You know, Rachel, when you were talking, I was thinking about how often our words don't match our works. And people will talk about their heart. Oh, yeah, we'd love to have anyone come to our church, or we have open hearts and minds, so to speak. But then when it comes to actually doing the work in an intentional way, in an informed way, that can get us beyond these otherwise good intentions to actually implementing and seeing the vision come to life. That's a challenge. It's been a challenge, and it remains a challenge. And yet there's folks that have gone before you, those of you listening, who have mined these things. And we can help you through this podcast learn to work smart, avoid mistakes, and gain credibility in this space.
Absolutely. What you were talking about reminded me of one of my favorite quotes from St. Augustine, you know, preach the gospel and if necessary, use words. So, how are we preaching that gospel? Just by our actions, by the way that we love and serve and listen to and walk alongside our community. You know, that's where I love the socially just element of mosaics too. Like, we can't just say we're the church. We have to step up and fight for, you know, equity and for assistance for people who are feeling marginalized in our community, because that's a God we serve, you know, a God who sees all, loves all, and embraces the outcast. So just so much
Yeah,
to
and
love
it's
and
yeah,
appreciate about mosaics. Go
well,
ahead.
and we appreciate you. I mean, we is you, as we say. You are the we and we're, right? You are the we and we're. And anybody listening, you're part of the Mosaix family. You know, we're not a denomination. We're not a network that you formally join. It's a relational network, again, built on mutual encouragement, peer learning, and just encouraging, pressing on to maturity, challenging one another in all those respects. And again, I'm so thankful for your energy, your heart, your passion, the work that you've done, the work that we'll do together. And I'm super excited about the new work that you're going to be doing, because you're actually stepping out here in a few months to begin the journey again to plant a church. But of course, given time, experience in the past, I'm sure you'll approach this work a little bit differently in the past. and of course, the things that you've learned, as well as what we're talking about here on the podcast, can help, of course, to inform that.
Absolutely. I'm super excited. And I love that we'll be having other voices come and join us on this podcast. I mean, I appreciate the diversity that you and I have, the way that we have this healthy respect. There are a lot of things we have in common, but, as you mentioned, our ages are different. I'm with a mainline denomination and you're not. And so I just feel like for folks that don't know where they kind of fit in, that hearing both of our perspectives and those of our guests that we have on will really help them get a broader understanding of who God is calling them to be and how God is calling them to respond and use these principles to apply right to their local context. So,
Yeah,
good
and for
good
sure.
days
And
ahead.
let me just, yeah, yes, absolutely. And let me just say this too, for your listening, those of you listening to this first episode, Rachel and I are not just going to be talking about matters of the heart, if you will, regarding what we're talking about. We're actually going to talk about systemic structures. So when Rachel was just talking about social justice, for instance, that's something that, whether it's on social media or out on the street, so to speak, everyone's talking about social justice, the need to advance it, et cetera. But there's a structural way to do that when it comes to your church, to your faith-based nonprofit, to your Christian school. Same way in terms of structural shift with the multi-ethnic church or with cultural intelligence or even financial sustainability. What we're talking about here and what we'll be talking about through this podcast and the resources and the people we'll bring to the table on your behalf are all going to get at this from a structural level, building a structure within your organization to actually advance on the multi-ethnic vision, on cultural intelligence, on social justice and community engagement transformation, and of course, looking at that financially sustainable piece. How do we fund the mission going forward in a rapidly changing society where tithes and offerings are not going to be enough alone to advance bold mission? As you say, Rachel, that's all the buzz today. And we're going to be bringing that resource, that experiential knowledge to this podcast. So for those of you listening, it's our first episode. We just wanted to introduce you to us. But you can tell, I hope, that Rachel and I are excited to do this, excited to be together. And Rachel, tell us where we're going, both as we finish up this episode and what we can look ahead to in the weeks to come.
Yeah, absolutely. First, I want to say that Mark and I are super excited to be here to offer this podcast to you, but you are important to us. Your voice matters as well. As Mark mentioned, this is a relational network. So if you have questions or if there are people that you think we should be talking to or stories that you want us to hear, make sure that you reach out, use that email, contact us so that your voice can be heard as well, because we're in this together. We truly are a community. So yes, this was our introductory first podcast where you got to know us a little bit better, but we hope that you tune in for our next episode in 2 weeks, where we're going to talk a little bit about the biblical why of a multi-ethnic church and why we so desperately need more multi-ethnic churches. So it's definitely a podcast you don't want to miss. We hope that you've enjoyed hearing a little bit more about us today, and we look forward to you joining us next time at Mosaix Today.